Welcome everyone to the 20th anniversary event of NWMI. So first, I'm going to just introduce the network and then welcome our esteemed guest to the panel. Somebody saying, I cannot see you. I hope you can see me now. Even if you cannot see me, I hope you can hear me, listen to me, and that's it. So about NWMI, sometimes, when you've received this really funny joke or a political meme, or there's a very interesting story that you've read, or maybe you just want to outrage, the first thing that you would go to is your safe space, your family, your gang. And that is what NWMI is for many of us, a safe space, our family, our gang, whatever you call it. And it is just not about sharing. NWMI, which turns 20 this year, actually turned 20 in January 2022. It's a forum that addresses issues related to media as a workplace. The network facilitates career advancement programs through the sharing of information, contacts, tips, leads, exchange of ideas and opinions, as well as mentoring. But most importantly, in a highly polarized and patriarchal world where women, and especially women journalists, are targeted, NWMI has been unwavering in extending support. It is a network that has bravely voiced support for women journalists across India who have been at the receiving end of all kinds of threats, abuse, and much more wild things. The NWMI also takes strong public positions on journalists' rights and media ethics, while standing alongside women journalists in various kinds of struggles for gender equality, safety, and justice at both individual and community levels. It strives to uphold media standards and ethics and to promote gender equality within the media as well as in the society. Now, you may think that's a really boring speech. You're just reading out a Wikipedia entry. I urge you to go to the NWMI website and check out the reports which my colleagues have put out over the years, whether it's on aggressive masculinity in the media, the underrepresentation of women, plights of women journalists in Kashmir, Afghanistan, etc., or even the extensive report we have done on the Tarun Tejpal case. The NWMI over the years has grown as a network. We have 650 members now. They are from all Indian states, working in print, digital, audiovisual, and in multiple languages. Before 2020, because that's how eras are divided, right? Before 2020 and after 2020. We used to have annual meetings for members used to come together for a national event. We'd actually meet each other. If things were normal, imagine the kind of fun all of us would have had meeting up somewhere, having the session inside a hall. But now we will make the most of this. So as the event was planned in January, since the anniversary falls in January, it was almost immediately decided that we would approach French-American economist Esther Duflo to be the keynote speaker. Our senior colleague Rajashri Das Gupta took the responsibility. She approached her, and then there were 2 or 3 tense days. So the question was, would the award-winning economist, in fact in 2019, she had received the Sverigis Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. She agreed to come for our event. But in 3 days' time, Rajashri received a reply saying, hello, yes, give me a little time to see if I can fit in. That's it. That simple was the reply, and there was a lot of relief. But a few days later, several NWMI members fell sick. Actually, I'm not even sure what wave it was anymore. I think the 3rd wave, and we had to postpone the celebration. So it was time again for Rajashri to approach Esther, but she was accommodative and approachable as usual and said, that sounds nice. I can participate in March. So it is with great pleasure and happiness and pride that I wish to welcome Esther Duflo as the keynote speaker to the NWMI's 20th anniversary celebrations. She is the Abdul Latif Jameel Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics in the Department of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a co-founder and co-director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. In her research, she seeks to understand the economic lives of the poor with the aim to help design and evaluate social policies. She has worked on health, education, financial inclusion, environment, and governance. She's one of the 2 global economists who changed the way poverty is measured and tackled from a theory-driven approach to one that is based on rigorous evidence. She earned her doctorate at MIT and made the institution break a rule about hiring its own students. The Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which she co-founded with husband and fellow Nobel Prize winner Abhijit Banerjee, is at the center of development economics, having transformed it to provide reliable answers about the best ways to fight global poverty. That's what the Nobel Prize Committee said. Esther's ties with India also runs deep. Not only is her work located in several regions of the country like Bengal and Rajasthan, but she has familial relationship and friendships. A close friend and co-researcher recalled several years ago when he and Esther were returning from Bengal after completing a pilot study for research, that when she spotted the Kolkata skyline, she said, "You know what? This is homecoming to me." Kolkata became an enduring relationship. Her husband, Abhijit Banerjee, is from the city. Her mother-in-law, Nirmala Banerjee, is among the country's first feminist economists, and her father-in-law, late Professor Deepak Banerjee's classes are legendary. The NWMI is proud to host you, Esther Duflo, as the keynote speaker for its anniversary event. She will be speaking on good economics for hard times with a focus on gender and media. So welcome to the event and welcome everyone else who's joining it. I'm actually feeling a bit strange because I cannot see any of my colleagues, but I know you're all out there smiling, waiting for the session to start. So over to you, Esther.
Thank you so very much for the invitation, first of all, for your wonderful work, second of all, and for this gracious introduction. I gave a reasonably generic title to this presentation because I wanted to kind of have the most time to think about what I really wanted to say. And in fact, what I'm going to talk about is a lot going to be talking about West Bengal and a lot going to talk about the work that I did with Raghat Chattopadhyay that you just mentioned. So the segue is excellent. What I thought I would do is to talk without slides in a more informal way for about 30 minutes and then have you ask me some follow-up questions, because I think an hour of me talking would become extraordinarily boring. I should also say that I also see only me, which I hate, so I will.
We're very much here. I just put myself out so that people can just see your face.
Yes, I think if you leave yourself on, yes. I feel I'm talking to a person.
Okay, fine.
That's nice. I think I am spotlighted anyways. So this is basically me talking to you and to you, to all of you present here. As you say, we've been doing that for 2 years, but I haven't quite yet gotten used to the talking to my computer concept. So what I finally decided to talk today, what I thought would be the most relevant to talk about, and my version in a sense of good economics for today, is a woman in politics. So it's not going to be a woman in the news media, because you know much more about that than I do, but it's going to be women in politics. And I think to some extent, the challenges that they face is also similar to the challenge that you face, and also I think we might have a role in covering not just their challenges but their triumphs. So during the COVID-19 crisis, suddenly people realized that there are some women in power around the world, and this woman actually appeared to be a particularly good job. This was, of course, the case of K.K. Shailaja, the health minister for Kerala, who was nominated for a Nobel Prize for Peace for her amazing job at controlling the epidemics in Kerala. Not so much the number of cases, but what happened to the people who suffered from the disease, and led to a much lower death burden in the state than anywhere else. But of course, there was also Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, Angela Merkel in Germany. And people, maybe for the first time, started to wonder, why are women better leaders? And a lot of people came and asked me these questions because I have done some research about women leadership. And I didn't give them necessarily the answer they wanted to hear, because I said, well, I don't know if they really are better. Maybe what these outcomes reflect is the fact that countries or states that are smart enough to put women in position of power are countries which in general would be smart enough to do what it takes to protect themselves for COVID. And countries that are concerned enough about issues of social welfare and social protection and solidarity and common good to put a woman in charge are also countries which would have done anyway. So I'm not very sure whether these leaders are doing better because they are women or because it's still very few countries and very special places perhaps that put a woman in charge. So that's not necessarily a very popular answer because people prefer, black and white, and finally they got into the idea that women are great, and so why am I just not saying it? But I think it's important because it's important to highlight at any point what we know and what we don't know. And in fact, what we do know, which I'm going to talk about, is we have many instances where we can say with a lot of certainty that women do things differently than men, and to have women in politics at the local or less local level does make a difference. With this, exception notwithstanding, there are very few women in position of power today. In parliament, just under 25% of women were parliamentarians in 2019, so about a quarter. That's a slow progress from about 10 years before, since in fact 20 years before, in the early 2000s, it was 17%. And even this 20% is achieved in part because of some form of quotas that are in place in many countries. So about half of the countries worldwide have some form of quotas for women in parliament. Sometimes it's mandated in the constitution, like it is in Nepal, for example. Sometimes it's part of the electoral law. Sometimes it's pure voluntarily quotas by leading parties, like it is in South Africa, for example, where the ANC has quotas, but other parties don't. But since if a leading party has a quota that has a material impact in the fraction of women in parliament, and therefore that's sort of counted in my half of the countries have something. Importantly, India is not one of them. Despite the fact that in some sense India was a pioneer first about the concept of political reservations, since we have seats reserved for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes for MPs and for MLAs. And because India was also among the early mover in having some form of set-asides for women in politics, but that was done at the local level. So the 1993 73rd Amendment of the Constitution of India mandated set-aside for women for all positions in the panchayat, at the ward level, and also at the sarpanch or pradhan level. So I think the intent of this first set of reservation for women was not to stop there. The intent was to see how it goes and progressively introduce reservation for women for MPs and for MLAs as well. But it didn't happen. In fact, there was a fight around it, and this, bizarrely enough, was defeated by socialists. Why socialists decided that women shouldn't have quotas, I don't know. But this is how it happened, and it was not put back on the table. And to my knowledge, at the moment, is not really a discussion. So, in some sense, India took the first step, but took the first step at its lowest level. Maybe felt, okay, we've done enough now. We can just let it be. But this is probably or surely insufficient, because the representation of women in MP and MLA assemblies is very, very low, both at the federal and at the state level. So what do we know about the role that women have had at the lowest local level? So when I was hanging out with Ragab in Birbhum, was really the beginning of a research agenda on looking precisely at this question. Research agenda that I started with Ragab in the very early 2000s. I was then joined by other like Rohini Pandey, Petya Topalova, Laurie Beeman, and Swati Bhattacharya, who've done a very interesting work on the place of women in these councils. It started in West Bengal. I extended this work in Rajasthan, and others have extended in other places. So when we started, that was the very early beginning. I got very interested in knowing whether these first batches of women elected as pradhan would make a difference in the type of public good that is being provided at the village level. And what was interesting is that as Raghav and I were talking to people at various levels, even our own interviewers, the most general point that was made by, in particular, all the men we encountered is, no, they can't make any difference. They are just the puppet for their husbands. They never speak. They are very shy. They don't do anything. They are purely stand-in. And in fact, the term pradhanpati came into being at the point. Something that I've done later that I've seen later in Rajasthan is when there is election on a reserved seat, there is a huge photo of the husband of the pradhan, of the sarpanch, the sarpanch candidate, and very small photo of the actual candidate, who is the wife. So that would seem to be going in this direction. And indeed, even in our own interview of pradhan, often, when we ask a question, that's the husband is the first to answer. So because of that sort of appearance of shyness, of being pushed to the side, of being replaced by their husbands, there was, I think, a general presumption that it wouldn't make too much of a difference. But what this was not taking into account is that there is a big difference between the public role that someone assumes and what they do in practice. So as women in media, and myself as a woman in academia, we are probably very familiar with the idea that sometimes there is no point shouting your mouth in public. You can just wait till the noise is gone and do your work calmly and quietly. And that's annoying, because maybe you would like to get credit for your work, but at the same time you also want the work to get done. So at some time it's just strategic to shut up and let things be. And in my conversation with pradhans, I've heard that often. They say, look, there's no point fighting, let them talk. But then at the end of the day, there's one person who is on this job 24/7, and it's me. So I can still do what I feel is important. So given that, it was kind of really an open question for me whether or not having this woman would make a difference. And therefore, if it's an open question, you try to find out. And by chance, it was at least conceptually remarkably easy because of the way that the reservation for pradhan were instituted. So in West Bengal in 1993, they didn't have reservation for pradhans. They felt that it would be enough to have reservation at the ward member. And if you have 1/3 of women elected at the ward member, which was the constitutional minimum, maybe 1/3 of these wards would decide to elect a pradhan, and that would meet that constitutional minimum as well. It didn't happen. In 1993, only 7% of the GP or Gram Panchayat ended up electing a woman. And I must say that's not unique to India. In Spain, they also have reservation for candidates at the municipal council levels, and there are very many women in municipal council as a result, but they don't get elected more as mayors. They are not given the most important position in the council. So that happens in West Bengal the same way it happens elsewhere. The government realized that in 1998 there was a change in the electoral law that says that in addition to the reservation of ward position for women, 1/3 of each village also need to be reserved for women. And then the question arose of how this third of villages would be selected. And maybe they had learned a bit from their experience that if there is any leeway left, this is not going to be done fairly for the women. So they decided that this is going to be randomly selected. So what happens is that the GPs are organized, they are ranked by their serial number, and then by order of their serial number. In the first election, all of the GP, they are counted 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. In the first election, all of the one get reserved for a woman. In the second election, they redid the list and recounted 1, 2, 3, and they reserved the second one, and so on and so forth. So as a result, there is really nothing systematically different between the GP that ended up being reserved for women and the GPs that weren't. And all we need to do is to see, midway to the term, all we needed to do was to see what was done. In order to find out what was done, what we did is we went to villages in Birbhum. In 165 GPs, we did it for a few villages per GP. And we collected with the villagers a very detailed map of what is there in the village through a participatory resource mapping exercises. So people came together and built a map, and as they built their map, they told us, for example, this well was repaired in the last 2 years, this well was built in the last 2 years, that piece of road was repaired, that piece of road has always been there, and so on and so forth. So from this map, we were able to design a data set which was telling us exactly what happened in the last 2 years. At the same time, we collected data on what women in the village find important. Because the key question I wanted to ask is not just whether women do things differently, but whether they do things in a way that better reflects women's preferences. So for that, I need to know what women's preferences are. And most commonly, the way that you decide what women want is you assume what women want. And in particular, you assume that if they, since they are women, they must be interested in kids and this type of things. But I thought, how do I know what women in villages in West Bengal ask? We really need to find out. We cannot just take it from the top of our hat. And I thought, what best way to find out what they want than to ask what was raised at the participatory assembly called the Gram Samsad, which are the meetings where everybody in the village is invited to discuss the issues that matter to them. So we collected information of what type of issues was raised by men and women in those Gram Samsad. And in West Bengal, we found something interesting there. We found that what women are really, really keen about is drinking water infrastructures, that's not surprising, and roads. What men deeply care about is roads as well, and irrigation facilities, and schools to some extent. So that there was a first surprise here that it's actually not women who were the first to mention schools, but it is what it is. Now what we can do is to look at, now that we know that women are particularly interested in drinking water and sanitation, we can look at whether in the villages that are reserved for women, we see more investment in drinking water and sanitation, and we find exactly that. We also found that they were particularly interested in roads, and we also found exactly that. And by the way, the reason why women in West Bengal are particularly interested in road repairs is mostly they do the road repair. So it's a form of employment also. So we found exactly that, and the effects were large. So we found that women were in fact, indeed, more likely to invest in goods that were of prime importance to the interest of women. Along the way, we also had collected all this information about discussions at the Gram Samsad. In 2012, Raghav Chattopadhyay and Swati Bhattacharjee did another round of this recording of the Gram Samsad, and found that over time women speak out more and feel even more free to speak up, which is, I think, to the testament of West Bengal. And what they also found is that in places that are reserved for women, it's not that women speak more, but they speak even more about the issues that are dear to them, like, for example, drinking water. So one channel by which we find women to be more responsive to the needs of women is probably that they understand them well themselves, but also that the very fact of having a woman in power helps other women express what they care about, and also express the pradhan themselves to talk about these issues. So these issues that had been a bit neglected come to the forefront. And of course, since women are half of the population in the village, if their needs have been neglected for many years, one can consider that it's a good thing that there is a catch-up, even if it means there is some sacrificing to be done elsewhere. So, for example, they were less likely to repair the local informal schools, although I'm going to be talking more about education in a minute. So that's what we found in West Bengal. So no one could say, well, West Bengal is very special. After all, today it's a woman who is a powerful chief minister, and this was not the case at the time, but the fact that a woman emerged reflect, in a sense, the different position of women compared to other states. So I replicated the exercise in Rajasthan, which can certainly not be accused of being too pro-woman. And in Rajasthan, we found just the same thing, that in places that are reserved for women, there is more investments in the goods that women prefer. And by the way, there is no less investment overall, so women are at least as competent in the first cycle. And in fact, over time, we find them, if anything, more. We found that in West Bengal, we found them to become more effective, to do more with the same budget than the men do. In the first cycle, they maybe do the same on average, but they direct it more towards women need. In the second cycle, they start to do more. In nationally representative data set, we also find that corruption declines in places that are reserved for women. So this was our first cycle, so women really did do things differently. One thing I was presenting this work in the, by now we are the mid-2000s, started presenting the result from this work, particularly in India, is that every time we presented it, there was one wise person, usually one wise man, to get up after I had presented this data, after I had shown the fact and showed pictures and maps and all so on, to tell me, no, but you don't understand, the women, they are not really leading, they are doing the job for their husband. And I said, yes, I know, I was already told that, but I just showed you the data. You have to let go of your prejudices if I show you data, but that's difficult and that takes some time. So that's basically, other than just being irritating, because after all, how can we have a conversation if I have to abandon my facts in favor of your theory? Especially when it's someone who maybe had never set foot in the field or certainly met one of these persons. So I thought that it would be important and interesting to address the question of prejudices itself, and in particular to address the question of whether this first experience that is imposed on people because they would not naturally elect a woman led to an evolution of attitude towards women in politics. Either the women who are running themselves, this first generation of candidates, or the more general concept of having a woman running the show. So with Rohini Pandey, Laurie Biman, Petya Topalova joining Gragap and I, we did another round of data collection in the middle of the second cycle of reservation now, where we replicated the collection on the public goods, but we also went and visited the households to find out what they think of their own pradhan, and also to find out what they think of the idea of women pradhan in general. So to find out what they think of the idea of women pradhan in general, first we asked them, and their people are remarkably blunt and transparent, so they don't like it. And they like it even less if they in fact have been reserved and therefore have had a woman. So one could see, well, this is like backlash. That if you impose women via quota, you're gonna make people even more upset and even more anti-woman. But you have to remember that when people answer these questions, they also are trying to tell you something that they hope you're gonna relay. And so if they don't like the quota, they might tell them not really what they think, but what they think you should know. And that in media is something you also need to be aware of. Is that people sometimes will tell you things because they think you're going to print it. That might not necessarily be their opinion, but it's the opinion that they think that other people should have. So the question as a researcher is how do you go past that, and how do you try and attempt to find out what people really think? And we did it in the following way. We took a speech that was given by one Gram Shamshed, by someone. We had a bunch of male actors and female actors record the speech. It's the same speech, but it's recorded by a male or a female voice. And then when we visited people, we randomly picked either the male voice or the female voice. We had them listen to the speech, and we asked them for their opinion of the speech and of the person themselves. On the speech, it was not a particularly good speech. The person was replying to requests from a villager about fixing the tube wells in their para. And the pradhan basically blows them off and say, no, we don't have the money, it's your problem, do it. So we didn't take like a spectacular speech or a horrible speech because we wanted that people could see, there could be a range of opinion in judging this. So the first fact is that when we have people listen to this speech in places that have never been reserved, men downgrade women enormously. They give them, if they think the speech has been given by a woman, they tell us it's a horrible speech. If they think the speech has been given by a man, they think it's good. So it's not the same people, right? But it's randomly selected whether you heard the female speech or the male speech, and it makes this a huge difference for how you rate it. That's the first point. The second point, this is not true for women who are more or less even-handed. The second point is that when you have reservation, at least one time, that is completely erased. That difference of opinion is completely erased. If anything, it goes back the other way, where men are a bit more generous towards the speech when they think it's been given to a woman. So that shows that having a woman in place has really changed the prejudices that people have, not necessarily about whether they like to have women in politics, but whether they think women are competent or not competent. So that was the second finding. The third finding then is, in some sense, the most important, is was it going to make a difference for the real pradhans? So if we had only asked people, what do you think of your own pradhan, we would have thought no, because people are very anti their own, these first women pradhan are really like the sacrificed generation, the trailblazers. But what happens is that when a seat has been reserved one time and becomes free again, so anybody can run the next cycle, we see a lot more women elected as pradhan. These are not the same women who had run the first time, because this one typically don't run again. These are new ones, but we see many more women being elected. And when the places has been reserved twice, we see even more women being elected. This again we were able to replicate in Rajasthan in another project we did with Clément Imbert and Abhijit Banerjee, where we collected data on what happens to the electoral fortune of women after reservation, and we found the same thing, that post-reservation, a woman, when the seat is free, is more likely to be elected, and it's not typically the same woman, because mostly the incumbent almost never run again. So that suggests that having reservation not only changed the outcome in the immediate, during the moment where the seat is reserved, but it also changes it more durably. It changes the whole political game more durably by suddenly making it possible for women to run for this position. And this is a very powerful argument for reservation, because some people object to quota saying, oh, it's anti-democratic because you restrict the choice. But if you think about the choice, not just for one election, but for a number of elections, you're actually not restricting the choice, you are opening the choices, because suddenly you put women who were never in consideration before as part of the lot that can be considered. So you've basically doubled the fraction of possible candidates that people have to choose from. So if we're thinking about the electoral game, not just one election, but over the long run, quotas actually expand democracy by expanding the pool of eligible candidates, not, of course, by law, but by what's authorized by social norms. So the next question is, well, but do you have to go through reservation, or is it enough to just tell people? Why do you have to go through this whole thing? Like for one cycle, it's going to be reserved, and the whole, implied tinkering with a political system that's complicated and introduces term limits that you may not like, and so on and so forth. Why not just tell people that women are actually good leaders? We've done these studies, many more studies. One can check that women are actually good and powerful leaders. So we tried that in Rajasthan, in that same project with Abhijit and Clément Imbert, where we looked at the long-term impact of reservation. We worked with an organization that does puppetry for a political campaign, or for social campaign, they also do. And they prepared, before the Rajasthan Panchayat election, they prepared a show that was to explain the role of the pradhan in Sarpanch in Rajasthan. And in the meantime, the NWMI program had also been launched, so the Sarpanch has this very key role in many states, including in Rajasthan, of actually administering the NWMI. And a good Sarpanch will do much more than a less good Sarpanch. So we collected data on what the Sarpanch do and how many days of work has been provided, not this particular one, but in the district as a whole. And try to explain people the role of the Sarpanch in solving the problems of the village, and also make people aware that they could run and they could do this job. It could be their job. So it was, in general, sort of political campaigning, not in favor of anybody in particular, but in favor of a broader participation of people, and also encouraging them through a play to look at the election of the Sarpanch more seriously, not just that rubber stamping whatever the elite tell them to do, but thinking about, who could it be, someone who is going to solve the problems and the issues we have in an effective way. So we did that. Actually, that was not puppetry, that was like street theater with music and all that. It was a lot of fun. It was a great play. A lot of people came to see. And the reaction to our base scenario was very good, where people, actually, we have an increase in the number of candidates, we have a decrease in the fraction of incumbents who get re-elected, and we have a decrease, and this decrease is particularly strong when the incumbents are not very good. So people seem to be more sensitive to the quality of the incumbent after they've seen the show. So that's all to say that people do pay attention to this show. So what we've done is that in some of the villages, the show was not just a show about Sarpanch, the role of the Sarpanch, but it also had some specific mention of female Sarpanches. And, the main character was played by a woman, and actually it's only men, but it was pretended to be a woman. And we also showed statistics that were disaggregated by gender, and showed that women are just as good as administering the NWMI than men. And the hope was that it would maybe short-circuit the need to have reservations if people are just told that women can do a good job. But in fact, what happened was, if anything, the opposite, where the woman campaign was less effective than the general campaign. So people, at the moment we introduced the team of women, just closed their ears and eyes and stopped listening about it. And so it was not possible. So the message didn't go through. And in fact, even the core message of opening your eyes and having a political choice that reflect the need of the village didn't go through. So that suggests that you can't circuit this process if you, and therefore we need to have ways to actually have women in action for people to realize for themselves how it can make a difference and how they can be effective and fair leaders. The last thing I'll say is that this another impact of having women as leaders, and that's true not just in politics but in the corporate world, in the media, in academia as well, is that they serve as role models. Is that having a woman in a position, in a visible position, increases the chance that other women, younger women, girls, etc., see that that's something they could do. And we found that in West Bengal. So at the same time as we did the work on discrimination for women politicians, we also collected data from parents of teenagers as well as the teenagers themselves about the aspiration for their boys and their girls. In general, we find huge gaps in aspiration for boys and girls. We find that parents think that all the boys should be highly educated and have a career and so on. But for the girls, they would think that they should stay home, or they are much more likely to say that they should stay home, or they should do whatever their husband wants them to do, and that they shouldn't have a career. In places that have been reserved for women, the gap still exists, but it's divided by about half. So there is a huge decline in the gap between the aspiration for boys and girls, both when we interview the parents and when we interview the teenagers themselves. And I told you a long time ago that having a woman as the pradhan does not lead to an increase in education. If anything, the pradhan don't really control education, since that's the state subject, but they just the informal center, they don't seem to be investing much of the informal center. What I did not tell you is what was the impact on kids' education. And here we have the impact on kids' education, which is teenagers. Among teenagers, girls were less likely to drop out of middle school when the woman was a sarpanch and was a pradhan than when the place was not reserved. So it's not because of anything the pradhan did herself. That's really not her job, and as we saw, that's not her main center of interest as well. But it has to be through this indirect effect on aspiration. So that gives us an even more longer term impact of having women in politics and in general of having women in prominent position. On this note, I'm going to end, so we have about 15 minutes left for questions.
Yes, I do have. Thank you very much. I do have a few questions, not exactly to do with the topic that you spoke about now, because people have not many other doubts. So I hope you would be okay with that. The first question is from my colleague and friend Rohini Mohan, a journalist. I'm going to combine that with the question from Avinash Kumar. He's a civil society activist, researcher, and former executive director of Amnesty India. Rohini asks, what is the ripple effect of economic sanctions, like the ones against Russia, on ordinary people in a globalized world? She asks, to become more self-sufficient in arms, instead of exporting from Russia, India will spend more on defense, taking money meant for food, education, development away. That's her question. In a question about the war itself and about authoritarian regimes, Avinash asks, how does welfare economics work in authoritarian regimes?
Okay, let me first ask you whether this is for quotation or this is just between us.
We can ask people to stop the live tweeting. That's not a problem, so that it stays. But it is live. It is live on YouTube. Yes.
It is live on YouTube. Okay, fine. Very good. So I'll keep that in consideration. So yes. Then the best answer is I don't know. It's a complicated question. I know how to think about it, but I don't have all of the parameters to think about it. So the impact of a trade ban with Russia depends on several things. It depends, first of all, on the fraction that Russia represents in the trade with the country. In particular, how much is imported from Russia, also how much is exported to Russia if Russia would retaliate by stopping. And it depends on the ease with which you can substitute away from the Russian things that you stop to things that are either imported from elsewhere or locally produced. So if you take Germany, for example, for them shutting down trade with Russia is a big deal. Not because Russia is a huge partner of Germany, on average it's only 2% of German trade that goes to Russia, but because they import gas, and it is difficult to substitute away because the Russian gas comes from a pipeline, it's very cheap, and in any other form of energy would need to come from some other sources. So the elasticity, what we called in economic jargon, the elasticity of substitution, which is the ease with which you can replace the German import of Russian gas with something else, is not high. So for them, it's going to be pretty hard. It can happen. It's definitely feasible. A group of German economists have calculated the cost, and it is, feasible. It's something that it's a few percent of GDP. It's not nothing, but it's something that a country like Germany can totally absorb if they so choose. In India, it seems to me that the cost would be much lower because India is a huge economy, which is largely closed in some sense. So a lot of what is being consumed in India is being produced in India or could be produced in India. And if you shut down with Russia, one would need to. The reason why I don't know the answer is I don't know this parameter for sure, but my guess is that nothing that comes from Russia is irreplaceable. Even the weapons that you talk about, they could be produced in India. True, it will cost some money, but on the other hand, it will also create jobs for people. So the net impact is probably not enormous, and I don't think the net budgetary impact would be so big that you would immediately see an effect on social spendings, particularly since there are other places where one could cut. So I wouldn't be too concerned about the economic effect of a stop in trade with Russia on the Indian economy. For India, it is more a political and diplomatic issue because India and Russia are closely aligned politically on many fronts.
Okay, so the next question is from Raksha Kumar, another NWMI member and journalist. She has a question from what you spoke about women in politics. She asks, at the level of the member of parliament and the member of the legislative assembly, the problem with politics in India is that more often than not, it is a family affair because of its ties to money and muscle men. In that case, Raksha asks, do you think that your findings at the lower levels, the panchayat levels, might hold true at the state and federal levels?
Yeah, even at the local level, it is largely a family affair, even if it doesn't involve drugs and money. In that there is often, for example, a movement from a husband to a wife, from a wife to a son, so there is this tendency, which is not particularly good, to have family politics even at the local level. And we saw that despite that, we still find an impact. I would say that even at the national level, when you see women take power, even if they take power as someone's wife or someone's husband, they still seem to be doing their own thing. So Imelda Marcos is not like her husband. She's not particularly nice either, but she does her own thing. And I would say, certainly Sonia Gandhi has been an extraordinarily powerful figure in politics, despite coming from the family. So the gender of people might still, might still continue to play a role, to the extent that actually when someone is in the driving seat, whatever they bring to the driving seat is pertinent. It might be it's not the only thing that matters, of course, and the national politics is very different because perhaps the constraints are much larger, the stakes are much larger, and so on. So in that sense, none of what I said might carry out. But I think the one thing that carries out is this general kind of view that you don't elect someone who will then reflect the interest of the people who elected them. You elect someone who, once they are in power, will do to a large extent whatever they want.
So we'll move on to the next question. It's from Nisha Agrawal, an economist and former CEO of Oxfam India. Nisha asks, what would it take to create a more gender equal India by 2047? That's India's 100th year of independence and, well, 25 years from now. So
like one of my mottos is that there are no silver bullets, just maybe many silver pellets, so we can try many things. But from my research, I think that one should be much less shy about using quotas in politics, in board seats, in administration, everywhere, and just bite the bullet and do it. And that in itself will have both a direct impact of having more women making decisions and being just equity per se, but it will have the type of indirect impact that I described in the talk. So that's one. Another one is to a key, really fundamental place of inequity between men and women in India is the labor force. The female labor force participation in India is one of the lowest in the world. Believe it or not, it is lower than it is in Saudi Arabia, and it's not improving. And there again, this is more a problem statement than what to do about it. But I don't think there is going to be gender equity by 2047 unless there is more labor force participation of women. How to act on that? It's a very, a lot of people are trying to work on these issues from all angles, from the social sector, from the corporate sector. Many of my students are working on this. And I think it's a combination of problems. It has to do with social norms. So it starts with educating kids at school. And the organization Breakthrough is doing wonderful work to try to make that happen in places as difficult as Haryana. It starts with providing opportunity for women which are more flexible. I have a student working with an organization in Kolkata that is providing gig work for women that they can do on their phone from their home, which is a way of kind of dipping your toe in the labor market. It comes through working through the husbands and the in-laws. Another of my students work with a huge carpet manufacturer in a very, 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 very patriarchal district of Uttar Pradesh, and found that showing a video to the in-laws and the husband about the advantage of a woman working had pretty large impact of women's willingness to start working in a job. It starts from empowering women by making them aware of their own strengths and what they can do. The same student is working with a group of psychologists on increasing the sense of self-efficacy that women can have, which can be done via cognitive behavioral therapy, group meetings, etc. So it's going to be a number of things. And none of them is going to solve the entire problem at once, but that is something which, beyond leadership, we really need to get into. Women need to be out and need to be out in the labor market in order for any equity to be possible down the road.
So I know we're running out of time, but we have one or two questions. If you don't mind taking those.
I can go for another couple of minutes. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So we have a question from Vaishna Roy. She's a senior journalist with The Hindu and NWMI member. So Vaishna asks that the attitude towards welfare benefits continues to be very mixed in India. In the post-pandemic economic crisis, what shapes can welfare programs take, especially for women in poor families?
Yes, one hope was that after the pandemic, people would realize that welfare programs are not charity, that welfare programs are insurance that the society needs to function, because everybody could be hit by a shock one day. And the fact that this welfare system were not in place in a way that was could be mobilized rapidly and effectively really was a huge shock at the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdowns, where we saw there was no reason why all these migrant workers would have to come home by foot and just to access the minimum help they needed. There should have been a system that was more robust and present wherever they were. And so that shows, I think that has highlighted the urgency to revise the system of social protection. In some states like Tamil Nadu, there is a discussion of having a home grant, which is basically a universal transfer to women, at least to women who are not themselves earning, in a well-paid salaried position. And that's an interesting idea, particularly if the home grant is relatively low and is available to people who need it simply by going and asking for it when they need it, because that would make sure that it's easy, it's there when you need it. But if you don't need it because you have enough to survive on, you don't bother collecting it, and that leaves enough money for people running around. I think a first step, I relatively recently became aware of the huge importance of a first step is social pensions, retirement. There is a small retirement pension available at the federal level and in most states. A lot of people don't get it, even when they are eligible. In Rajasthan, in Tamil Nadu, we collected data on people who don't get it and people who do get it. In a rural area, people who don't get the pension are actually poorer than people who do get the social pension. So there is a problem of targeting. This could be really simplified, and that's something that the current government is thinking about seriously. This could be totally streamlined by saying that anybody above 70 is eligible for it and just gets it, as long as they are, alive. And this would make a huge difference for women, particularly widows. So something we discovered by surveying in Tamil Nadu is that 16% of elderly people live entirely alone. 16%, more than 1 in 6, which is something that nobody knew, because we have this idea that a lot of older people are taken care of by their extended family, but it's simply not true anymore. The kids are the first people have had fewer kids, and they have gone to the village, to the city from the village. So the widows are alone. 85% of these people living entirely alone are women. Compared to people who live in families, they are poorer. They are more likely to have food security issues. They have faster cognitive decline. They are very depressed, and they have they are hampered in their activity of daily living. So starting by guaranteeing everyone in this group a pension would actually have huge welfare effect. And I think this is something beyond which the nation should really be able to rally without much political fight, and would be an important good step in reforming the system.
So I'm going to just ask the last question. I'm going to combine two questions. One is from Brunel D'Souza. She asked that women in politics is not a monolithic category. How do you look at caste, tribal status when it comes to reservation or affirmative action? And how would religion now mediate? And another question is from Damini Ratnam. Does political representation also play a role on policy decisions that affect women voters? Can your research be extended to provide insight? Damini Ratnam works with the Hindustan Times.
So for the second question, I think that's what I tried to say, to show that in fact when you have a woman in politics, they do things that better reflect the interest of women, and women are the women voters. For the second question, one thing one could do for the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe question is, since there are also reservations for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, and the reservation for women is within each of these category. We looked at reservations for women SC and for women ST. For women ST, we don't have very many, so I don't have much conclusive to say, but for women ST, the effects were very much the same as for women in the general population. For religion, it's harder because there are no, there are obviously no quotas, and the Birbhum district where we did the study we didn't have much variation in religion, so I don't have much to say there. Although I do acknowledge that it's a super important question.
Yes, I still forget to unmute myself. So we have a lot more questions coming, but obviously I don't want to ask you to stay back for more. So thank you very much for answering those questions. And because we said open for questions, I'm getting a lot of pings on my WhatsApp from members with questions, but they will all have to wait. So thank you very much, Esther, for this brilliant session. I call it deterrent factor when the media reports saying that, oh, the woman is just a puppet for the man in the family and she is now standing for elections. A lot of male politicians are also managed by their families when they come to power. So I don't think it matters. Anyways, thank you very much for that, for all those insights. And to everyone joining here, the keynote session is over, but we have a lot of things lined up. For example, tomorrow we have this panel discussion with the Women Cinema Collective in Kerala. We have a lineup of women in the cinema industries from across, which is Bollywood, Telugu, Tamil, etc. They're going to speak about why women need to tell their stories and be in them in the film industry. So do join these sessions. We are looking forward to all of you coming in. Thank you so much. Thank you, Esther, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.